Hello, my AP Psychology students. This is a screencast in case we have a snow day or cold day tomorrow. And I've also linked this PowerPoint slides to Schoology. So if you need to go at a slower pace to get every label down, that's just, that way you have that ability because this can only last 15 minutes. So today it's all about building a brain. If you remember, this is our unit about biological basis of behavior. And we talked about the big idea of the nervous system. And then we talked about the building blocks of the nervous system, which is the neuron, and the different types of neurons. And now and the neural firing. So now we're trying to put that all together into the brain. And so as we think about the brain, there's a lot to it, obviously. But I want to point out that as you look at the two-dimensional diagrams that are in your binder, how very misleading they are for a three-dimensional brain. So if you can kind of think of, our cerebral cortex here as a thinking cap that fits over every other part of the brain and how they slide it out here. Hopefully that will help um, with the frustrations of trying to label everything. Hopefully also we'll be in person and so I can kind of walk you through this and act it out with you. But hey, if we're not, here's our second chance. Okay, so first of all, starting with the cerebral cortex, like your Biker does, cerebral and your book, the cerebral cortex is the thinking cap, as I mentioned, four lobes times two hemispheres. So there's actually eight lobes, excuse me. But as your textbook or your prep book pointed out, um, we usually just talk about four lobes, okay? And your book also talked about how this cerebral cortex, this thinking cap, this part that truly makes us human, is 67% of the entire brain mass. So that's a lot in the apple skin of the brain. Something I want you to add and be aware of is that the brain is made up of neural networks. All of these neurons, all these inner neurons that make up the brain, they do work in conjunction with each other. And this is a phrase that you'll hear me say a lot: neurons that fire together, wire together. So think about a child as you're learning things, what something looks like, what the name of it is, and the function of it is. Those neurons are going to fire together. And then over the course of them firing and firing and firing, they will actually build up a network. So if you think of a dog and what a dog looks like, and then learning the word dog and learning that dogs bark and all of those things, they all go together and they literally start this network in our brain. Okay. As your book also said, that over 100 billion interneurons in the entire brain. And wow, that's a lot. Outnumbers those sensory and motor neurons. And then also, I'm hoping that you could find this okay, but the corpus callosum, this, first of all, this always looks terrible in diagrams. So I brought up this picture, and this is if, like, say, I'm looking at the front of your brain, okay? This corpus callosum is this bundle of nerves that connect the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. And as your book pointed out, that's why also, as we cross over here, the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body and vice versa. And so I just like this picture much better because, like I said, it's just hard to see these in diagrams. Okay, so as you look at your page 6 of your binder, you should have been able to, when you look not only at the descriptions, but also at what happens with the functioning if it's damaged. Though that was in your book. Hopefully you found all of that. And just as you try to shade this, okay, this does a really nice job of showing the one, two, three, four different lobes that we have, but also within these lobes, we have these specialized areas. And again, your book kind of shows you that as well. But I really think it kind of helps for us to shade these. So if we start with the frontal lobe, and within the frontal lobe, we've got, well, we really could actually color another area here, the prefrontal cortex. But we've also got the Broca's area and the motor strip. Those are all within the frontal lobe. Then we've got our parietal lobe that's got does a lot with sensation and perception and association areas. And within that, and your book talks about the two different functions of the parietal lobe, the specific sensory cortex is where all the sensations from our skin, anywhere in our body, comes into our brain. And your textbook, your prep book, excuse me, also talks about how the parts that are more sensitive of our body get more of these neuron hookups here. So how your hand, much more sensitive, gets more of these neurons in the sensory cortex, excuse me, or the somatosensory cortex than your thigh does because your thigh's not as sensitive. But yet, if I would drop some hot water on my thigh, it would still register. It would still register up here, okay? But it's just not as intense as what it would be on the hand, okay? Then we go to the occipital lobe in the back, and our visual cortex is right in there. And on Friday, we talked about the feature detectors, the specialized interneurons called the feature detectors. And since those deal with sight, they would all be right back here. And then we've got our temporal lobe, okay, functions a lot with hearing, but also Wernicke's area is within the temporal lobe, and it's for language comprehension. Okay. And then finally, I just want to go back and talk a little bit about mirror neurons, which we talked about. There's no place really to label them there, which is fine. But since we did talk about those just the other day and how they help us learn socially to copy other people, well, those are really located right around here, right around the motor cortex in the frontal lobe, which makes sense because it's copying movements and facial expressions and that sort of thing. Okay. All right, for the lower part of the brain, okay? So this is not exactly the same that's in your diagram, but most of it does go in order. If we start at the bottom, okay, your brain stem is this entire aspect of the brain right here, okay? And then your first line to fill in at the bottom is the medulla, okay, right here. And medulla helps, keeping our heart beating. So one of the mnemonics that I have for you is medulla is like Medusa. If you see Medusa, you freeze, so your heart would start beating and you wouldn't breathe anymore. So that's kind of important there. And all these mnemonics are on page 8 of your binder, so don't feel like you have to write those in. The next space above it, I would like you to label as the pons. Okay. Your book does a nice job of putting that, telling us what the pons does. And I don't know, for some reason, I also put that in your class binder. So you get that information twice. It's okay. But our pons is a connection point. And so as we swim across the pond, we want to make sure we stay awake because it has a lot to do with sleeping and dreaming. Okay. Now, the next line up, okay, is the amygdala. Okay, that looks a little bit, it's kind of hard to see. Again, your diagram's a little different than this one, but the amygdala, Amy G. Dalla, okay, that is again very much part of the limbic system. And especially with fear and disgust, things are registered there. It's very much a gut reaction aspect. The line above that should be the pituitary gland. And so that's the little bell-shaped ball, I guess, that's hanging down here. This is the master gland. It controls and communicates with all the other glands of the body. And then right above that, okay, again, this diagram looks a little different than yours, but it's the line, the next line up is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is really important in so many functions. Um, I call it the 5 F's. Fight or flight, which we've talked about. Food, because it's appetite. Fanning, as if I'm going to fan my face because I'm hot, because it deals with temperature. And then the last one, F, is fornication. Okay. And then um, we're going to skip the next two lines on your particular diagram. Okay. And we're going to come back down to the bottom line on your page, which is pointing to the cerebellum. Okay. Now, this is going to get confusing, but I'm going to try my best. On your diagram on page 7, the next line up, I actually have right down here, okay, the reticular formation, or the RAS, reticular activating system. And the reason, again, in a two-dimensional diagram, this is so hard to understand, but the reticular formation is actually a bundle of nerves that runs all the way through the brainstem, all the way up into the thalamus. And it really is a filtering system of what gets into the brain as far as attention is concerned. Okay? So, first line was cerebellum, second line should be reticular formation. The next line up, I would like you to label that as hippocampus. And again, the hippos go to campus to learn. This is all about learning and memory, and it shows up a little better here on this diagram, but it's this crescent shape that comes around here in our brain, and it's really, really active when we sleep as far as getting stuff into memory. Okay. Uh, don't worry about this. This is not on your diagram, so that's why I covered it up. The pineal gland, that is not on your diagram either, but that is important in sleep. Don't worry about diagramming that. We'll talk about that later. Okay, and then these are switched around, not in where they look like or what they're pointing to, but on your diagram, okay, the next line up is pointing to that egg shape structure, the thalamus. And then the very top line is pointing to that bundle of nerves, but it's cut in half here, and that's the corpus callosum. Okay, so again, you can go back and look at this a little slower. Um, and I'm not going to have time to finish this in this round. So, yeah, I'm going to stop this recording and hopefully we won't even need it, but I'm just going to get it saved just in case.